Hello and welcome to this behind-the-scenes recording on Eurofound's research. This is a bit of a new format because we want to investigate a particular issue for the European Parliament's Gender Equality Week. There is perhaps no single issue that's as representative of inequalities in the labour market as the gender pay gap. Despite decades of work in this area, different legislative measures, women still make 12% less than men, even for controlling for differences in working hours. This enduring pay gap places a high degree of urgency on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, which sets a June 2026 deadline for transposition into national law. So here to speak about this issues, the progress that has been made on the gender pay gap and gender equality on the labour market are two of our researchers that work a lot in this area. Christine, I will start with you. There is a lot of talk about pay transparency in the context of the directive. Before we go into the details of it specifically, can you tell me about what pay transparency means in its most basic sense?
Yeah, thanks, James, for this question. So pay transparency measure, that's an umbrella term for many different measures. But in principle, what we subsume under this term is any type of measure that lifts the secrecy around pay. Or if you want to say it in more economic speech, then we could also say it's about reducing the asymmetries that exist between the employer on the one side and employees on the other side in relation to pay. And so, as I said, it's an umbrella term, so there are many different types of measures. For example, the simplest version would be sometimes people are contractually or even legally not entitled to talk about their own pay to work colleagues, for instance. And a simple measure would be to just lift this ban and not, punish people for doing that. Or another measure would be to give employees the right to ask their employer, how was my pay set up? How is my pay progression? How did this come about? And how does my pay compare to comparable employees, so other co-workers doing the same or equivalent type of work? And then we have other pay transparency measure. Probably the most commonly known one is the pay reporting. Might have different names in the member states, but where companies are then asked to report on what's the average pay for women, for men, and what's the pay gap, the average pay gap. And that could be broken down by, the types of jobs that people do or how far they are up in the pay scale. And then you could also have another requirement, another pay transparency measure is then for companies to go deeper and do a pay audit and to look into what's the causes of pay gaps that we might detect, and how is this linked to job evaluation systems that we have in place, job classification systems, and if we evaluate them, can we find out which screws to turn around so to reduce the gap?
So we have that's a good definition then of what we were talking about when it comes to pay transparency. Marianna, looking more at the legislative area, how did the Pay Transparency Directive come about and what does it aim to achieve?
Well, the Pay Transparency Directive has a long history into the making of it, but I would say that the biggest push was the very early initiatives of some of the member states, particularly the Nordic countries. They had their experience with pay transparency. They introduced some elements and some legislation measures in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then there was a recommendation in 2014 by the Commission where we got a further push because the assessment was that not enough was done. So an extra push towards more pay transparency measures. And here we had a little bit more movement, like, for example, Germany, Ireland, Lithuania, and the latest in Spain in 2021. But this was not yet enough. So that's when the directive came into place. And the idea of the directive is to harmonize the efforts that are already available in the EU. So to have a common ground for those who have already done something in it, but also for those member states who have nothing in place to really push them to do something. So this harmonizing and pushing is the main objective of the directive, beyond what Christina said about tackling any form of discrimination, direct or indirect.
So, Christine, Marianna referred there that some of the measures that were in place previously were not sufficient in reducing the gap or increasing the level of transparency. What's your assessment then on whether the existing national pay transparency measures are effective?
Yeah, I think I would formulate it a little bit differently. So it wasn't, before we talk about how effective are these measures in reducing the pay gap, and what Marianna was referring to, the reason why the Pay Transparency Directive came into place was that many of the countries hadn't acted. So, I mean, they didn't have any measures. Half of Europe approximately didn't have any sort of measures in place yet. So this is the first thing that came up after the evaluation of the recommendation in 2014, that the directive now says, okay, it's not only as in the recommendation that member states are asked to introduce at least one of these measures, but now they're asked to implement a range of these measures. Among them, several of the ones that I've referred to in my first question. And yes, then of course there comes the question about the effectiveness of the measures and do they help to reduce the gender pay gap? And also there I think we need to be very precise in what is the gender pay gap. So the directive doesn't really tackle the entirety of causes that the gender pay gap that you quoted, at aggregate level can be related to. But the directive really targets companies and within the companies, so to say, company level pay gaps with most of the measures that it has in. And so when we're talking about effectiveness, one thing that we set out, Marianna and I, when we started our research 2-3 years ago, is that we wanted to have a look, what have companies actually learned in the meantime, the ones that have actually implemented some measures. Were they good and were they effective in reducing the company level pay gaps? And we were so disappointed, I must say, that hardly any of the countries that had actually introduced these measures had then followed up with a decent evaluation, an official evaluation where government had said, okay, we introduced this measure and this is, what we learned about the introduction. So we had to go a little bit further, and so we started to expand our search and we looked at academic studies. And fortunately, academia has started to fill this evaluation gap. And there's now a number of studies that try to compare what's going on at company level. And for those companies that have been exposed to pay transparency measures and before it was rolled out and then after it was rolled out, and compare them with comparable companies. And the results are that the effects are mixed, right? So we do find studies and countries that show, yes, they were effective. They did reduce the gender pay gap, often by reducing a little bit the growth of men's wages compared to women's wages. So you had this pay compression. But yes, they did what they strived to achieve. But then in other countries, other academic research finds that, okay, it didn't really have a measurable, significant effect. And then, of course, we can look into the questions, why is that the case? Do you want to take over from here? A little bit more about why?
I think it very much depends on what kind of instruments were implemented, because there is a variety of instruments, and the more we know about the different elements of it, the better it is for us, so that the design of whatever pay transparency measure we want to implement, it is as efficient as possible. So whether or not they work depends very much on the setup, on what kind of information it's disclosed, at what stage, at what level. And I think what the research has done well for us was that we could pinpoint at what works, at some elements of the pay transparency measures that work and what should be included. One of the things that is already included in the directive is that workers don't have to go and ask for the information, but the information is given to them. And this is very important for women, so that the information is given to them without them needing to react to anything and be active in that request, for example.
So is your assessment here that there is quite a gap between what's going on at the legislative level and what is being implemented at the company level? and it's to do with the specifics of the implementation in how effective they are at addressing the issue.
Yes and no. I think this is certainly the second part of the answer. The first part of the answer is that often the legislation is not entirely either clear yet or as good as it could be. So take Marianna's example where she said a measure where women have to ask, workers have to ask, is much less likely to be taken up. And this was the case that the big German evaluation found of the German Entgelttransparenzgesetz, that hardly any employees either knew about it or they didn't, want to ask. They felt afraid of asking because of, being afraid of having repercussions if you ask, what's my pay? How has it been set in relation to a comparable set of workers? So it's by design, it's by choice of measures, but then also how are the measures designed? And that's, already grounded in legislation. So take, for example, the Austrian or the Luxembourgish pay reporting requirement. Companies are obliged to report, but no one knows what the reports then actually say, so they're completely confined to the company level. And whereas if you look at the UK, where we found that a lot of evaluation studies have found that they were effective in reducing the gender pay gap, their companies clearly have to publish their reports on a website. And, with this comes media attention, comes a little bit of name and shame. Companies are obliged, kind of forced, by peer pressure, I would say, to show what they're doing if there is a pay gap and where this might come from, which then obviously helps them to recruit further people, etc., etc. But these type of publicly available pay transparency measures, they have consistently proven across research in meta-studies that they work better in reducing the gender pay gap.
So the greater level of transparency, the greater impact that there is on the pay gap.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, you wanted to add to that?
Oh yeah, I could talk for hours.
Well, I was going to ask then about the current state of progress at member state level on transposing the directive. You mentioned already member states who had measures in place. This deadline is looming of June next year. What's the current state of play then when it comes to implementation?
Yeah. I think that there we have different levels of progress. Of course, the countries that already had something in place are at an advantage in the sense that they have to adjust their measures to what the directive requires. There is only one country that has fully transposed it by now. They did it at the end of 2024, and it's a portion of Belgium, the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, that did it. And then what some member states was to adopt portions of what the directive requires, and those portions are the most straightforward to implement. It's like adding to job advertisement the pay or the pay range for that specific job advertised. It is about having gender-neutral job titles in the advertisement. So those were the implementations that we call as partial. And then there is a lot of work that we could document that is been going around drafting this new pay transparency legislation. And then for some member states, we could not detect anything, which doesn't mean that there is anything. It just means that it's not out there for us to assess. So very different degrees of implementation of what the directive is setting out for 2026.
And then maybe also to add here, on the one hand, yes, governments are super busy in preparing the legislation, to implement these measures. But at the same time, I think what we also notice is that companies are already advancing this legislation and trying to get ready for the requirement. So set up the structures to report. And one particular aspect that we looked at in another research report that will come out in December is how companies go about setting up gender-neutral pay structures. And so what does this mean? Gender-neutral pay structure means that however you classify your jobs and then link the pay to the jobs, you ensure that this is looked through a gender lens and that jobs that are predominantly done by women are not, valued less if there are objective grounds that the activities that people were who are working in this job and are carrying out, if you compare them to other workers with who are grouped differently. So you really look at the way the jobs have been classified, and is it based on objective criteria, but are these criteria also gender neutral?
Is this to address then segregation within workplaces, so that you might have equality within a section which is dominated by either men or women, but then between different sections of an organization you would have inequality?
I think this goes more in depth, and it's a very basic principle that you always had since the inception, that it's that men and women should be paid equally for the same work, but they should be paid equally also for work of equal value. And I think that's where it comes. The putting into practice that principle is by means of this gender neutral job evaluation. It's not about making sure that men and women are paid the same for the same job. That's that's discrimination. It's straightforward. It's really looking at the value of the work that men and women do, and the fact that sometimes jobs that are predominantly done by women are undervalued because of what the work entails. It's undervalued. So it's really about that.
Which I know is an area of research that you're both working on at the moment. I said initially that I sort of referenced how long-standing the issue of the gender pay gap is in Europe. I have the feeling that June 2026 is not the end of the road. And I just wanted to ask them, when it comes to after the implementation of the directive, I mean, you already referenced, Christine, the role of academia in charting what has been done so far. What kind of things do you think is going to be relevant to monitor, and what's going to be Eurofound's role in the monitoring of the implementation?
Well, you can start, Christina.
Yeah, we have several ideas. Obviously, it will be very important to see, first of all, how is the legislation designed? Because obviously, even if we can expect some degree of harmonization, member states typically design the measures in line with, their own approaches and their own systems. So comparing the legislation, but then also looking at how do member states go about this rollout phase, because what is on paper is one thing, but then how is it implemented in practice is another thing. And particularly important also from Eurofound angle will be how will the requirement that the worker representatives have to be involved in the design of the measures, in the implementation of the measures. Are they can ask, questions about the reports. How is that being implemented? And then especially in systems where you don't have a company level worker representative on board. So that's, I would say, a typical Eurofound question that we are keen to investigate. And then also, what's the role of the equality bodies? Because in our research, we found that there was not much linkage in the case studies that we've looked at. So, and they will be given a specific role.
I think that overall, it's also a good opportunity for us to get more data on the pay transparency measures. It will also be interesting to see which member states are going to evaluate what they put in place and what comes out of it, so that we learn more about what works best, and what's the degree of impact that these measures have. And I think not necessarily about gender pay gap reporting only, but also the other measures that we have, like, for example, introducing salary ranges or salary level in job advertisements. I think also that would be interesting to look into and see where this brings us.
Yeah. And then, sorry, we have many questions. But I think another aspect that ties in well with other work that we are doing here at Eurofound is the role of collective agreements and of social partners. Because obviously pay is not set in a vacuum. In many countries, fortunately, we still have a high collective bargaining coverage, a collective agreement at sectoral level. And these collective agreements, they might have already some kind of job classifications in some kind of pay structures. And how do we ensure that these structures are gender neutral? Are they already gender neutral? Will we see action from the social partners reviewing and auditing these pay structures and renegotiating them? And we already see from our research that this can be a lengthy process, obviously, because it's much more complicated to set a pay structure for so and so many thousands of workers in different companies. And then how will companies connect to the collective agreements, and can they rely on the collective agreement to be gender neutral in the pay structure? That's, I think, another thing that we have on the research radar.
Well, it's a very relevant conversation to have this week. I'm always a little bit hesitant to say that, because whenever you say, well, it's the European Parliament's Gender Equality Week or it's International Women's Day, it gives the impression that this is something that has been prepared for the occasion, but this really is research that is ongoing, and these are just opportunities to shine a spotlight on it. I know that both of you are involved in quite a few research projects linked to this at the moment. Christine and Marianna's article on gender pay transparency in the EU, steps taken and lessons learned, is available on our website. It's a very insightful introduction to this issue, and it's really a gateway into the broader research that you've done. You also have a paper, if I'm not mistaken, that's due, I think, this month. And then this is all part of a larger research project as well, which comes out in December, which is equal value, equal pay, which you've already referred to the importance of that in the context of this legislation. It's on concepts, mechanisms, and implementation towards gender pay equity, and involves 16 case studies. So it gives those practical examples that you already referred to. You'll also find further analysis on this work, including in the first findings of the European Working Conditions Survey 2024, which has a gender equality analysis throughout the survey on our website. But for now, thank you very much, Marianna and Christine, for your insights.